Alright, so today what we're going to be talking about is how to use statistics, how to make it kind of work for us, and what we can actually do with statistics. So, typically when you're using statistics, your ultimate goal is to answer a question. So today I'm standing in my backyard next to my garden, and the question I might want to answer is related to what I did last night, which is I mowed the lawn. So I went through with my lawnmower and I mowed the lawn, and I might want to ask the question, is my blade okay? Does it need to be sharpened? Does it need to be replaced? And the way that I would answer that question is to kind of look around at the grass and see whether or not the grass is uniformly cut. So ultimately I want to know whether or not the blade needs to be changed out in my lawnmower. And the way that I'm going to do it is I'm going to use statistics. In statistics, we can do what's called an observational study, where we observe a sample of our population, and while we observe them, we pull our data from them, we do some type of measurement, some type of observation, and then we use that data to actually describe, interpret, and then analyze and possibly make inferences about the population. So here, it might feel like my population is the lawnmower, since that's what I'm asking my question about, but in essence, my population is actually the grass, the blades of grass. Because in order for me to know whether or not I need to sharpen my lawnmower blade, I actually need to look at the grass that it just tried to cut. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to take this population, whose individuals consist of blades of grass, and it's fine that your population doesn't have people as the individuals, and I'm going to collect data from my population. So here what I've got is I got a bunch of grass, and I'm going to end up measuring the grass. So my variable, the thing that varies from individual to individual then, is going to be the measurement. How many inches long is the blade of grass? Now of course I could just start measuring right here. So I've got a piece that's 3 1/4 inches, another blade of grass that's 3 1/4 inches, another blade of grass that's 3 1/4 inches, another blade of grass that's 3 1/2 inches, and I could continue doing this until I measured every single blade of grass. This would certainly answer my question, because I'd be looking at the entire population. And when we look at the entire population, what we're doing is we're running a census. And it would be a great way to try to get that done, except for, as you can imagine, number one, you wouldn't want to watch me make a video about measuring every single blade of grass in my backyard. Number two, I wouldn't want to do it. So, if I'm not going to run a census, the question is, how do I choose which blades of grass to look at? How do I choose the sample? The sample is the subset of the population that we actually collect data from. So if I want to choose my sample, what I'd end up doing is thinking about a couple different ways to choose a sample. The first way that comes to mind is what I essentially just did. I could get down right here and measure these blades of grass. 3 1/4, 3 1/4, 3 1/2, right? I actually measured them right where I was standing, right in front of my garden. And that's what we call a convenient sample. And it's a convenient sample because it's convenient to look right where you're at, to ask the people that are closest to you to measure the blades of grass that are closest to you, to ask your friends if you're running some type of sample that could consist of your friends. If you're running some type of study that you could use that sample. Another type of sample is what we call a voluntary sample. Voluntary sample means that the individuals that are part of my sample volunteer to be part of my sample. In order for us to do it with this particular observational study, the grass would have to go, I want to be measured, but that's not going to happen. On the other hand, depending on the study that you're running, you could have a voluntary sample. Say you go into a restaurant and you say, hey, what do you guys think of Donald Trump? You would have a number of people come up to you and say, I hate Donald Trump. And you'd have a number of people come up to you and say, I love Donald Trump. Now those people that come up to you and say these things, these people are volunteering their responses. So that's why those people would consist of your voluntary sample. Those are the people that you're actually collecting data from. There are other ways to do samples as well, some that make sense in the backyard, some that don't. One of them is called a systematic sampling. Systematic sampling means you have a system for choosing who's part of your sample. So for example, I could go every 5 feet, stop, and look at a blade of grass. So I stop, go 5 feet, stop, measure a blade of grass, 3¼ inches. Go another 5 feet, stop, measure a blade of grass, 3½ inches. Go another 5 feet, so on and so forth. And I can continue doing this throughout the entire yard. That would be a systematic sampling. Another way of sampling would be to do cluster sampling. So here in my backyard, I could break it up into groups. So I could actually have this part of the yard, that part of the yard, and each part of the yard would have the same size. Those would be my clusters. And then I could measure every blade of grass in the cluster. So how would I do it? Maybe I break my yard up into 100 clusters, and then I randomly choose a number between 1 and 100. And then once I get that number, I go to that cluster and I measure every blade of grass in the cluster. And then I choose another number and I could do a few clusters, and I measure every single blade of grass in the cluster. So that's one way of doing it. I could also use what's called stratified sampling. Stratified sampling is kind of like clustered sampling in that you pick groups. So I would break the yard up into different groups, and then while I'm inside that group, I would choose random pieces of grass. So that's stratified sampling. And then the last one that I want to talk about is simple random sampling. Simple random sampling means you're randomly selecting blades of grass out of your backyard. Random sampling is very, very nice. It's a really good way to actually sample. The issue is, and you can imagine, how do you randomly select blades of grass? Because if you're looking here, you might say, oh, I'll just pick this one, and then I'll pick that one, and I'll pick this one. And the thing is, what if there's something in your mind that's kind of drawing you towards the different blades of grass? That one's pretty, that one's green, things like that. Or what if you just try to avoid standing next to the fence? So what about those blades of grass? They're important as well. Or what if you try to stay closer to the fence because you think you might neglect it? Well, what about the other parts of the yard? To truly be random, you have to have some way of randomizing which blades of grass you choose. And so today I kind of want to show you a little bit about how I'm going to randomly choose blades of grass, because that's part of our statistical study, is how do you actually randomly choose things, and there are a variety of different ways. Even in the stratified sampling, we mentioned that you were going to randomly select blades of grass in your strata. So how do you do that? And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. By the way, in a stratified sample, the strata are supposed to have things in common with them. So in my backyard, it really just means that I'm breaking it up into groups that I can actually call my strata. If you're talking about a population of people, your strata might be something where each group or strata are similar in nature. And what you could do in order to make that truly happen is you could make sure that each group has the same number of men, same number of women, same number of older people, same number of younger people, and things of that nature. So just kind of keep that in mind, that when you're talking about a stratified sample, your strata or your groups should be similar. Before I go to the random sampling for this particular backyard and talking about how you select the blades of grass, what I also want to talk about a little bit is an experiment. So observational studies are when you observe. Experiments are when you actually kind of, in some sense, create the data. You make some changes. So for example, if I was talking about an experiment, what I might try to do is figure out if, for example, if I put fertilizer on this side of the yard and no fertilizer on the other side of the yard, which side of the yard grows faster, or something along that nature, or which side grows greener, or which side has less death in the grass. So that's an experiment because I'm actually making a change. Now, in an experiment, the individuals that we're studying are what we call subjects or participants. So in this particular example, I could still have the blades of grass be my subjects for my experiment. And I still have a variable. In fact, I have two variables. So the variable here is I might try to figure out whether or not fertilizer is going to increase the rate at which the grass grows. So I can still talk about measuring the actual length of the grass. That's what I call my response variable. It's the thing that responds to whatever change I make. The explanatory variable is another variable that shows up in the experiment. The explanatory variable is the thing that's actually being changed in order to get some type of response. In this case, it's whether or not you have fertilizer, right? So if I put fertilizer on this side and no fertilizer on that side, then the fact that I put fertilizer here, that's an explanatory variable. It has fertilizer, yes. Doesn't have fertilizer, no. When I run an experiment, I have what's called treatments or treatment groups. So this side of the yard would be one group, and the treatment that it would receive would be fertilizer. And that side of the yard is another treatment group, and the treatment that it would receive is nothing. Now, in this case, we would call this the control group. The control group is the part that receives nothing, right? So in this case, we have the control group. It gets nothing. If you're thinking about taking medicine, it'd be the group that gets nothing. But there's an issue with that. And the issue is that, in general, in an experiment, you can have what's called a confounding variable. Confounding variable is something that affects the experiment, which you didn't intend to. So in the backyard, a confounding variable might be sunlight and shadow. Maybe this side of the yard's in more shadow than this side. So that would certainly change how things are growing, but that's not what I was looking for. I was looking whether or not the fertilizer was making the change. So when we talk about something like sunlight, this becomes a confounding variable. A confounding variable for taking medicine, if you were taking like Tylenol and seeing if that works, would be just the fact that you took it. Sometimes taking something makes us feel like we're actually going to have some type of effect. And so if I take something and feel that feeling that like my headache has gone away, we call that the placebo effect. Just simply taking it makes you feel like your headache goes away. That's the placebo effect. So what we do in an experiment that involves something like medicine is we give what's called a placebo. A placebo is something that isn't really anything. It might be a sugar pill or a glass of water that has some flavoring in it, just to make you think that you're getting the actual treatment, the medicine. And then the placebo effect can kind of be diminished when you actually measure the results in the very end. And of course we'll be talking more detail about how these experiments are really run. But in an experiment, you're actually making some type of change, and you're looking to see what happens with those changes. So now what I want to do is I want to show you a little bit about how we would actually do the random sampling for grass. And so I'm going to kind of show you what I've done to my backyard. And in my backyard, what I've got here, let me kind of pop this off here. I'm going to take the camera off and show you what I've got. Is I've got my yard broken up into 6 different segments. So I've broken it up with a rope. You can kind of see that the yard is broken up into 6 segments. And in these 6 segments, what I could do is I could randomly select a segment. Well, how do I randomly select a segment? I think the best way is with a gigantic die. So what I could do then is I could roll the die. And the die has landed on 4. So I could go to segment 1, 2, 3, 4. So here is the 4th segment. In the 4th segment, I could then break it up into another 6 pieces. And then I could roll the other die. And I could continue to do this. So now the other die has landed on 3. And then in this segment, I could go to the 3rd, 6th. And I could continue doing this until I get all the way down to 1 blade of grass. And that blade of grass would be my first blade of grass for my sample. And then to get the other blades of grass, I would continue to do this until eventually I get enough blades of grass to actually get through an entire sample. And that would make up my sample, and then I could measure those blades of grass and I would be able to figure out what's going on. Alright, so that is it for section 1.3, and we'll be talking about section 1.4 next time. Have a good one.